Hollywood's golden age was built on glamour, spectacle, and carefully constructed illusions. But Paul Newman, one of the few stars who spoke his mind without fear, saw through it all. In interviews across his career, he reflected on colleagues whose off-screen behavior was nothing short of monstrous. These weren't rumors. These were patterns of abuse, violence, and cruelty that Hollywood's most powerful studios worked overtime to bury. Today, we're pulling back the curtain on the actors Paul Newman and those closest to him identified as the darkest figures behind the golden glow. Some of these names will shock you. Others will rewrite everything you thought you knew about Hollywood's most beloved icons. Let's begin. Number 1. Joan Crawford. Joan Crawford won her Oscar for Mildred Pierce in 1946, accepting it in a white gown while the industry celebrated her as one of its greatest stars. But inside her Brentwood home, a very different story was unfolding. Her adopted daughter Christina Crawford broke the silence in her 1978 memoir, Mommy Dearest, describing years of physical and psychological abuse. Wire hangers became weapons. Punishment came in the middle of the night. Christina described being yanked from bed, screamed at, and beaten for infractions as small as untidy closets. Studio friends who visited the home later admitted they saw signs they chose to ignore. Crawford cultivated a public image of devoted motherhood, posing for family photographs and giving interviews about her children. The contrast between that image and Christina's testimony haunted Hollywood for years after the book's release. Number 2. Bing Crosby. To the American public, Bing Crosby was warmth itself. White Christmas, the road pictures, a voice that felt like a fireplace on a winter evening. NBC marketed him as the ideal family man, and audiences believed it completely. His son Gary Crosby shattered that image in his 1983 memoir, Going My Own Way. Gary described a father who ruled the household through fear, administered harsh physical punishment, and showed almost no warmth toward his children. He wrote that the contrast between the man audiences adored and the father he knew was something he spent decades trying to reconcile. The tragedy ran even deeper. Two of Crosby's sons, Dennis and Lindsay, both died by suicide in 1989 and 1991. Those who knew the family said the weight of their upbringing never left them. Hollywood insiders knew the truth, but Crosby's commercial value made him untouchable. Number 3. Errol Flynn. Errol Flynn was perhaps the most dangerous kind of Hollywood star. Genuinely charismatic, legally connected, and largely above accountability. In 1942, Flynn was charged with statutory rape involving 2 underage girls. The trial was one of the most sensational in Los Angeles history, drawing enormous press coverage and packed courtrooms. Flynn was acquitted, but the details that emerged during testimony painted a disturbing picture. Parties, access, and young women placed in situations they had no power to refuse. His legal team was formidable, his studio stood firmly behind him, and his career continued almost without interruption. Investigative journalists noted that witnesses were difficult to locate and that Flynn's inner circle had been remarkably effective at managing the story. He died in 1959 at just 50. His legacy remains one of Hollywood's most contested. Number 4. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney was MGM's biggest box office draw through the late 1930s and early 1940s. The Andy Hardy series made him a symbol of American decency. But the studio system that elevated him also shielded him from consequences. Multiple actresses from that era later described uncomfortable encounters with Rooney, who used his status freely. The power imbalance between a top-billed star and younger contract players was enormous. Refusing him risked your career, and complaining simply wasn't something the studio structure permitted. Rooney himself, in his later years, acknowledged a life lived with considerable recklessness. He married 8 times and admitted to compulsive behavior. In 2011, he testified before the U.S. Senate about elder abuse after his own stepson allegedly exploited him financially. The man who once had unchecked power ended his life almost entirely dependent on others. Number 5. Bette Davis. Bette Davis was one of the greatest film actresses who ever lived. She was also, by wide account, extraordinarily difficult to work with in ways that crossed from demanding into genuinely harmful. Her feud with Joan Crawford on the set of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in 1962 is Hollywood legend. Physical altercations occurred during filming. Davis acknowledged kicking Crawford during one scene. Crawford later wore a weighted belt during scenes where Davis had to drag her, causing Davis to suffer a back injury. Director Robert Aldrich later said managing the two women was the hardest thing he ever did professionally. Beyond Crawford, Davis had a reputation for publicly humiliating younger actors and crew members. Her own daughter wrote a memoir in 1985 describing a deeply troubled relationship. Her talent was undeniable, but that same ferocity, directed at people with far less power, caused real damage. Number 6. Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas built his legend on strength in Spartacus, in Champion, in Paths of Glory. He was celebrated as one of Hollywood's most bankable and respected stars for decades. The most serious allegation against Douglas came from Natalie Wood's sister, Lana Wood, who wrote in her memoir that a teenage Natalie, around 15 at the time, had a deeply distressing encounter with Douglas in the early 1950s. Lana wrote that Natalie returned from a meeting with him visibly shaken and upset, and that the experience affected her profoundly. Natalie herself never publicly named Douglas, but spoke in later interviews about the impossible vulnerability of young actresses inside the studio system. Douglas died in 2020 at 103, celebrated with tributes from across the industry. The allegations existed alongside those tributes, largely unaddressed and unresolved. Number 7. Wallace Beery. Wallace Beery won an Oscar for The Champ in 1932 and was one of MGM's most reliable stars. Gruff and lovable on screen. Off-screen, the picture was considerably darker. The most serious allegation surrounding Beery involves the 1937 death of Ted Healy, founder of the Three Stooges. Healy was found dead after a night that reportedly included a violent altercation outside a Hollywood nightclub. Witnesses placed Beery near the scene. MGM moved quickly, sending Beery out of the country within days. The official cause of death was listed as alcohol-related and no charges were filed. Decades later, accounts from people present that night suggested the official story had significant gaps. Gloria Swanson, who was briefly married to Beery, wrote in her memoir that he had been violent toward her during their marriage and that she ended it as quickly as she possibly could. These are not just stories about flawed individuals. They are the story of a system, one that decided fame and profit were worth more than the safety of the people these stars hurt. Paul Newman understood that. He spoke carefully but clearly about an industry that rewarded silence and punished honesty. The question worth sitting with is this: now that we know, what do we do with these legacies? Do we separate the art from the person? Do we let the film stand while naming the darkness alongside them? Or does knowing change everything we see when the lights go down? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. And if this video opened your eyes to a side of Hollywood you never knew existed, make sure you subscribe, because we're just getting started.